Okay, so we start recording. Today's class is a continuation of our first class on Pareto boxes and optimality. So we're gonna have Pareto optimality and Edgeworth box. So an allocation next in the Edgeworth box is Pareto optimal or Pareto efficient. If there is no other allocation X prime in the Edgeworth box, such that X prime is preferred for every individual in the box, for individual 1 and 2, and then there is some individual for which this is strictly preferred. So the important thing here is that in the Edgeworth box, the simple version we're looking at, there is only 2 individuals. Technology is not really playing a role yet. We'll understand that a little bit more in a while. There is only what's called free disposal technology, so you can only throw away endowments, but nothing else. So what is optimality? So optimality essentially means that you're going to have feasible allocations inside the box. That's the main requirement. And then something is Pareto optimal if there is no other allocation for which this allocation is at the same time feasible and Pareto dominates the original allocation. Pareto dominance means, when we know this, that essentially you have that the allocation X prime dominates X if it is as good for everyone and then strictly better for one individual, okay? Now, in the Edgeworth box, the Pareto set, it's going to be the set of allocations that are Pareto optimal for all possible endowments that add up to the fixed market endowment. So I'm gonna draw it after we go through the theory. The Pareto set has the property that any element has to be in the tangency of the preference curve. So this is the key part. So again, finding the Pareto set is one of the classical questions in the core exam. Essentially, it's trivial if you do classical preferences such as Cobb-Douglas or others. It's super trivial. You just find it as the intersection, the tangency of the two indifference curves, right? So you just find the points of tangency, and then essentially that describes the Pareto set together with feasibility. We're gonna try to, essentially, why is that? Because remember that this is the set of allocations under which nobody else can improve without making the other individual worse off, right? So they have to be exactly at the tangency of the indifference curves. One thing that you have to remember is that the Pareto set doesn't take into account endowments, right? So for building the Pareto set, you can forget about the endowments. So essentially, right, the Pareto set is just, it depends on the feasibility and on the preferences. It does not depend on endowments. So in the typical core question, people will make it harder. And I don't do those questions, but that's how it is. Other people do. Essentially, they are hard because they change the preferences to non-standard preferences, okay? So non-standard preferences are going to be harder. Non-standard preferences will include things that are not monotone, and then the Pareto set can be a little bit weird. So that's part of you that you have to practice, but today we're gonna try to understand what it is more conceptually and try to understand for traditional preferences, okay? The Pareto set has the property that any element has to be in the tangency of the preference curve. As I say, any well-rationed equilibrium allocation of X star necessarily belongs to the Pareto set. So one important thing that we're gonna prove, right, is that any well-rationed allocation is Pareto optimal, right, under Lockeland association. So this is gonna be the case that any well-rationed allocation under this assumption, right, belongs to the Pareto set. So essentially, right, this is an important caveat. So let's add this here so it's very clear. Under convexity assumptions, a planner can achieve any desired Pareto optimal allocation by appropriately redistributing wealth in a lump sum fashion. So this is the second welfare theorem. Essentially, what I'm saying here informally is that you can choose a Pareto allocation, and then you can redistribute endowments to be able to achieve that Pareto allocation by means of just lump sum redistribution, okay, of endowments. So in order to capture these ideas more deeply, we have to introduce what is called equilibrium with transfers. So an allocation X star in the Edgeworth box is supportable as an equilibrium with transfers if there is a price system P star and well transfers T1, T2 two individuals, such as T1 plus T2 is equal to 0. So a lump sum, such that each consumer I, we have the following, that X star, which is the allocation that we're studying, is in equilibrium with transfers. If it is preference maximizing, essentially for the endogenous budget constraint in the Edgeworth box. What is endogenous budget constraint with transfers is P star times the allocation, right? Less than equal to P star times endowment. And then essentially this means that this describes the endogenous budget in the Edgeworth box, and this is describing liquidity maximization within the Edgeworth box for each individual. So look at the subscripts. This is for all I, so for all individuals, so 1 and 2. And then the typical Edgeworth box budget is modified with a lump sum transfer TI. Okay. So that endogenous wealth is now given by the multiplication of the prices times the individual endowment plus the transfer. Okay. So whatever is your initial endowment, then you're going to get a transfer. Okay. Now this is what is called an equilibrium with transfer. So you're still preference maximizing within your endogenous budget, but on top of the prices times endowment, you have a transfer. That's the only change. Now, claim number 9, if the preference of the consumer in the Edgeworth box are continuous, convex, and strongly monotone, so hence special case of local association, then any Pareto optimal allocation is supportable as an equilibrium with transfer. So this is an interesting fact that we're gonna here just observe because it's trivial, but then we're gonna prove for general economists, is the fact that whenever you have convex preferences, then you can essentially support any Pareto allocation in the Pareto set with an equilibrium with transfers. So the reason why you need convexity, so convexity is the additional assumption that we're adding here. And in fact, this is kind of the main assumption. Of course, the strong monotonicity is there. Convexity really makes this feasible. And essentially, this comes due to a fact from convex analysis that means that you can separate two convex sets by means of a hyperplane. This is separating hyperplane theorem. We're going to study this a little bit deeper later on. Right now, this is just an observation almost. Okay, so one thing I want to do before moving on is that I'm going to move to the iPad in a second. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to share the iPad. So. Okay. Okay, great. So if we have our Edgeworth box, let me write another, draw another one. So we have this Edgeworth box as usual, two goods, two consumers. Remember, the things inside the box are the feasible set. So all this big box is the set of feasible allocations. Anything inside the box is feasible. Now, imagine the preferences of individual 1 drawn by red are going to be classical Cobb-Douglas, you know? And then there's the preferences of individual 2 are going to be the same, classical Cobb-Douglas. Okay, so then essentially this tangency of every set is going to describe the Pareto set. So the Pareto set is all set of feasible allocations where this tangency is happening. And then of course the rest, I'm completing them. So it can only be the blue line because nothing outside the box is feasible. So it's not Pareto, it's unfeasible, right? So it has to be feasible and it has to be such that if you change that allocation, you're going to be worse off. So take any allocation, right? That is in the Pareto set. So all the blue line is the Pareto set. Now take that particular point inside the Pareto set. So now let's show why it's Pareto, right? It's Pareto optimal. So essentially, right, if you move outside the set, right? So say that you move here, right, to this point here, X prime. Then what happens? You can see clearly that this is going to be preferred for 1, strictly preferred for 1, right? But it's going to be strictly worse for 2, okay? You understand? Okay. So essentially these points in the Pareto frontier, right? You cannot improve upon, right? So if you're there, then essentially you're trapped, right? So this is a Pareto thing. So any point outside, right, is gonna represent this outside. It's gonna be blocked by one of them. Okay. In particular, in this case, it's gonna be blocked by individual two. Okay. That's it. Now, this is essentially the classical case for the classical preferences, right? Did I have to consider endowments? Not really, right? So remember, this is only about feasibility and preferences. Now, if I have weird preferences, the Pareto set is not usually as nice. So be careful, right? This is only the textbook version, the one that I can teach you. The ones that, the special cases that you're gonna see in the problems practices that you get for the core exam, then you have to be careful, but essentially the definition is the same, right? So if you apply the definition, you're gonna be fine. One thing also, so some people are bad at drawing. I was one of them. I'm not great at drawing. So what I did is I essentially used the definition of the Pareto set, right? And tried to use just math to define the Pareto set. So mathematically, we define the Pareto set, right? So given certain preferences, you can compute it, right? Analytically. So both things are possible. Some people are better at the drawing part and they can do it. In this case, the Pareto set indeed is a graphical tool set. So you can do it graphically, right? But you can also do it analytically. So whatever is better for you, okay? So everyone, any question here for the Pareto set and this part? Nope. Then what we're gonna do is the supportability of elements in the Pareto set as an equilibrium with transfers, right? So essentially, let's take the same point in the Pareto set, right? Now this is a point I decide to choose because I'm the social planner here. I want to implement that particular allocation. So how can I do it? Essentially, I basically can support it as a price equilibrium with transfers. What it means is that I'm gonna use other color for this. I'm gonna use this Western purple, right? So essentially what it means is that I can essentially support it through a price, right? And then this price is gonna pass through an endowment, right? So essentially, I can choose any point really. So I can choose, for instance, this particular endowment, which is gonna be, remember if the endowment was here, right? Then the capital T is gonna move it wherever I want, okay? So that's the whole point of the transfers, right? So if the endowment is something that is given in the box, right? So let's imagine it's there. So now say I want to implement the blue point as a price equilibrium with transfers. So then essentially what I do is I draw the price, right? And then I move the endowment through the lump sum, okay? The capital T is just a shift of the endowment to wherever I want, okay? So with the transfers capital T, I can move the endowment in the box wherever I want. That's it, basically. So how does it work? You see that the convexity matters. So the shape of this upper contour set of each preference is convex. Do you realize that? Convexity allows me to separate it. Let's make a zoom of that idea. So imagine here that I have another case with two preferences, and now they are not convex, right? So this is the preference of individual two, and then I'm gonna do the preference of individual one, right? Now, so first of all, right, it's very difficult to compute the tangencies. In particular, right, here everything is gonna kind of fall apart from the nice things we did before, right? So for instance, in this case, they are not convex. So some points are not gonna be supportable and others are gonna be supportable. Like for instance, this point here, it's supportable by a price, but if there is a point here, it may not be. So in other words, convexity is a sufficient condition for supportability, but it's not a necessary condition, okay? So there may be some preferences that fail to be convex that are supportable and generate basically points in the Pareto set that can be supported. Can you compute the Pareto set with preferences that are not convex? For sure. So yeah, so just make sure that you realize that there are two things, right? The first thing is characterizing the Pareto set. For that, you need just the feasible set, so the box. And second, you need the preferences. And then essentially you need to apply the definition of Pareto optimality to be able to characterize the set. Now, any well-rational allocation and the local association is going to be in the Pareto set. So essentially, any equilibrium of this economy, competitive equilibrium, is going to be inside the blue line under local association. Now, another point is that what happens if I am a social planner and I want to implement a point in the blue line by means of a market mechanism? So the way I'm going to do it is by means of a price and an endowment. So endowments are original to the box, are a primitive. This is the point there with omega. I'm going to use transfers that are lump sum to be able to move them, right, to wherever I want. And essentially, this result that we're going to prove later with care tells me that as long as preferences are convex, that means that the upper contour set is a convex set, right? Then I can basically pass a line separating the both of them. This drawing is not perfect, obviously, but the idea is that the line passes through the tangency point, okay? And then essentially that is the supporting price. And then in order to be able to move the endowment to that particular price, I'm going to be able to use the transfers to move wherever I want, okay? And this is the implementation part. So this is two separate things, two separate concepts that we're going to repeat again. So, but right now, this is just understood inside the box, okay? So now let's move again to the notes. And then we're going to introduce a second model. So the first model that we introduce is the Edgeworth box. I explain essentially the main parts of the box, how it works, how you compute an equilibrium, right? We did an analytical example with the Ophir curve and the Cobb-Douglas references last class. Right now, I introduced other two components of the box, the Pareto set, right? And then we also introduced the idea of supportability of some elements of the Pareto set. Okay. Now, one thing that I want now to move on is we're going to move to the second part of this tool set of economies that is called the one consumer, one producer economy. This model is actually popular in macro. Usually people call it the Robinson Crusoe model, right? With this tale, you know, that Robinson Crusoe goes to an island, right? And then he's alone. And then essentially he's faced with a dilemma of, you know, working or getting coconuts, right? Climbing up a palm tree, or just having leisure, right? Just laying down in the shade of the trees or in the sun. And, you know, this trade-off essentially is done in terms to maximize utility, the utility function of this guy. Okay, so this problem is going to be written in a more convoluted way, and essentially we're going to do the same trick. We're going to try to write down this problem in a decentralized fashion and in a centralized fashion. So remember this idea, right? So one is Robinson Crusoe is his own boss. He has this technology to be able to produce home producing, right? Home production. He's able to try to produce his coconuts for eating, right? And he's also be able to you know, to produce, well, to just have leisure and enjoy it. And then the question, you know, a little bit of mathematical game is, can we decentralize this? So now instead of having Robinson Crusoe, now we're going to create two entities. One entity is going to be a consumer, so you're going to just focus on maximizing your utility, and another entity is going to focus on just the production of coconuts. And this is going to be the decentralized version of the same problem. And essentially, we're going to show they give you the same results under certain assumptions. So that's the kind of motivation. So this one consumer, one producer economy is going to make the point that the outcomes of general equilibrium are going to be the same when they are decentralized as if they are produced by a central planifier, such as the Robinson Crusoe guy. Okay, so right now we're going to study the decentralized version. So there is a consumer and a technology. The consumer has continuous, convex, and strongly monotone preferences, wonderful preferences, the nicest possible ones, not that the likes that you're going to see in the core exam. they always throw you some non-convexities there to, to make your life more difficult, and also some failures of monotonicity. But here we're gonna study the nice version. So this is a nice, wonderful preference. And now they're just gonna have two goods. The first one is leisure, and the second is consumption, right? So coconuts. Now the endowment is time. So it's the time that you have at your disposal. So within a day, so somehow the time frame of this economy is the day. So you're gonna have the endowment of 24 hours, and there is no endowment of coconuts. So no coconuts on the land, on the tree, on the soil. So the consumer can produce the consumption good by means of labor. So Robinson has to spend some time, climbing the tree, and then he has a production function, right? That denotes his skills to climb trees. Z is going to be the labor input. So essentially, this firm that produces coconuts is going to need some labor input, and we're going to denote it by Z. To produce output, the firm must hire the consumer, effectively purchasing some of the consumer's leisure from him. So remember, this is a decentralized problem of decision making. So Robinson Crusoe wrote an algorithm. He called it the firm that is going to decide, how much to produce coconuts for him. Like, he doesn't want to think about it. And now, essentially, the firm, is programmed to maximize profits and takes prices as given. So the price of its output, essentially, the price of the coconut is going to be denoted by P, and then W is going to be the price of labor, so the wage. Then the firm solves the profit maximization problem, which is maximize the quantity of input that I need to maximize the profit, which is prices of the output times the number of coconuts produces with input Z minus the cost of the hiring this labor, which is W wage times the units of labor. And then given prices PW, the firm's optimal labor demand is going to be denoted by the function Z of P and W. It's essentially a demand function, but of inputs, right? This is the quantity of labor that you require according to the price of the output P and of the wages. And the output produced by the firm is going to be denoted by the function Q, that is also a function of P and W. And these profits are pi of P and W. The consumer is the sole owner of the firm and receives all profits earned by the firm, okay? So essentially, as I told you, Robinson wrote this algorithm to decide, how much coconuts he's going to produce. The firm is programmed to maximize profits. The firm produces coconuts, generates the profits, and then gives all the money back to Robinson, okay? And now the utility of the consumer is a utility of two goods, as I said, leisure and coconuts. And then the problem of the consumer is going to be maximize the utility subject to the choices of coconuts to be consumed and the units of labor. And then there is, as usual, an endogenous budget where there is the multiplication of the cost of the coconuts times the number of coconuts you consume, less than equal than the endogenous budget. The endogenous budget is the multiplication of units of labor you actually are using. So this is W times overline the endowment minus X1 units of labor. X1 is leisure time. So L minus X1 is the units of labor. And then you're going to have the profit, right? Since you are the sole owner of the firm, you receive the whole profit. So here there is no theta. Remember in the previous definitions that we have this theta, that was the share that that demonstrated the fraction of ownership that you had in any firm, right? Here, there is no longer any theta because profits go directly to Robinson. Okay, so as you can see here, the endogenous income is this multiplication of wages times units of labor plus profits. The budget constraint of the consumer is given by that, right? Now the consumer optimal demand at these prices is going to be denoted by X1. And notice here the notation that is a bit tricky. Notation here essentially tells you that this X depends on P and W. So in previous chapters, we used the W for wealth. This is not the case here, right? Prices here are prices of coconuts and W are the prices of labor. So this is the wage, right? So your demand is going to depend, of course, here on the whole vector of prices of the economy, right? Do you understand? So it's just a notation thing in Mascolel, but essentially here W does not mean the same as before, right? This W is the price of the input of the firm, right? And then P is the price of the output of the firm. So in fact, X1 and X2 is not only the optimal demand, but it's also the offer curve. So if we use the proper name, so of course it's an optimal demand with endogenous income, right? But the way Mascolel sometimes call it, and sometimes it's confusing, is also the offer curve, right? So it's the offer curve as the price vector of the economy is X1, X2. Now, our rational equilibrium in this economy involves a price vector P star W star at which the consumption and labor market clears. So again, so when you want to do market clearing, you have to identify the goods. How many goods do we have? Two, leisure and coconuts. So first of all, I want to clear the market of coconuts. So essentially, I want the demand of Robinson of coconuts at the equilibrium price to be equal to the quantity of coconuts produced in the economy. So X2 is equal to Q, okay? Supply is equal to demand, okay? And then you also have here below the market of leisure, so labor, it's mirror image, right? So here's labor. So the units of labor in sum are equal to the units of labor supplied by the consumer, right? So equal, okay? And then essentially these two equations will basically have two unknowns, which is P star and W star, and then you will solve them. Now, first thing, we know that because of homogeneity of degree zero and Locke association, then essentially we have that one of these markets is redundant, right? So if we solve the market clearing conditions for one market, then this means that the second market is gonna clear. Second observation, remember that we cannot recover prices and W separately. We only can recover them up to a ratio, right? So we can have to normalize one of the prices to one, and then we're gonna recover essentially the price of the other, or essentially we can recover P divided by W. We cannot recover them separately. So in other words, we can only recover relative prices. So in this case, we can essentially solve, fix, for instance, prices of coconut to one, and then just solve for this for the wage. Now, the actual solution of this problem will require us to do parametric assumptions, right? To be able to obtain a particular price of wage. So I have to put, for instance, that the utility is a sort of Cobb-Douglas, and I have to do the production function to be another Cobb-Douglas, for instance, or CES. So after parameterizing, I can go and solve this Robinson-Crusoe economy and obtain closed forms for the price and W. At this stage, since I didn't make any assumption, then I'm going to stop there. So these equations are going to characterize fully the P star W star. Yes, Martin, you have a question?
Yes, very brief one. So my question is it the same to assume the problems of the consumer and the producer in relative terms in order to get this?
So what do you mean
for
by
example,
that?
Divided by the price of, I don't know, the coconuts or whatever?
Yeah. So
okay,
that's essentially what I said. So
okay,
you can simplify the problem
Mm.
by, for instance, taking and dividing everything by P, right?
Okay.
Which means that everything is going to be written in terms of relative prices, right? So we know that due to homogeneity degree zero, and in the rational case, we need to do that. So you are only going to be able to recover relative prices. So equivalently, you can fix the price of the coconuts to one, and then only focus on recovering the wages, okay? Okay. Now, look at this claim, and this is the point of this thing. So a particular consumption leisure combination can arise in a competitive equilibrium. With the competitive equilibrium is the thing we just described, so the decentralized problem. And now this is equivalent to the following. So this means the if and only if. It maximizes the consumer's utility subject to the economist's technological and endowment constraints. So in other words, if there is a central planner, right, Robinson-Crusoe, essentially doesn't do the computer program that basically is in charge of the production of coconuts, but sits down and says, this is my utility, and this is my technology, and I'm gonna solve the following problem. Maximize the utility of consumption of coconuts and leisure subject to the technology of the economy, such that the consumption, the coconuts that I produce are equal to the production function evaluated at the units of labor that I decided to put, right? So I am Robinson Crusoe, I decide to work over line L minus X1 hours, and this produces X2 coconuts, okay? So solving this problem for Robinson essentially will produce the same solution that the decentralized problem that we just described. So if you solve the problem here of the central planner, this is gonna be a Pareto optimal, right? And then essentially we say that a decentralized problem stated before has the same solution as the central planner problem, right? So the decentralized solution achieves the same outcome as the centralized problem. Any questions here? Hi guys. Hi guys, I'm back. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I lost you because I am not using a network cable this time. My network cable died. So Wi-Fi is always a little bit random. This problem and centralized problem are essentially the same. This is the result of two things. If you realize the Robinson Crusoe problem here, we're assuming essentially some things about the utility and the production function. They have to be of certain shapes. The utility function has to be concave or quasi-concave, and the production function has to be essentially, you know, describing a convex technology, as in the chapter of production function. Okay. So this thing means that I'm gonna draw it in a second, but this again is gonna allow me to apply the separating hyperplane theorem. Okay. And okay, so with this in hand, we're gonna just move to the equilibrium and hi guys, I don't know what happened with the connection right now. So okay, so we have this thing here of the equilibrium and its basic welfare properties. So what we have right now here is that we're gonna have I consumers and J firms and L commodities. We're gonna take essentially the Edgeworth box and blow it up. So we're gonna make it super general. We're gonna have capital I consumers, we're gonna have L goods, not only two consumers, two goods. Preferences are gonna be super heterogeneous, so indexed by sub I. Each firm, now we're gonna introduce firms for the first time, are gonna be characterized by a production technology, capital Y, as in the chapter of production. We assume that Yj is not empty and closed. And then the initial resources in the economy are given by omega, right? Omega again is a vector that contains goods, L goods, right? And then is indexed by all individuals. The data is essentially a triple. So we have preferences, technologies, and then endowments. And then from this, we're gonna try to predict prices, right? We're gonna call an economy pure exchange if we simplify the technology to the following. So we say that technology is just gonna be equal for all firms to minus RL. This is called the free disposal technology. So essentially what it means is that you have a garbage can and you can throw there the endowments that you have. So imagine I create an economy where you have apples and oranges, right? And then in these apples and oranges, I'm gonna allow you to dispose of them freely. Remember that if I'm an experimenter, I can decide, for instance, to make you pay to dispose of apples, right? So say that, for instance, you don't like apples, then if you decide to throw them in the trash, I can decide to make you pay. I can decide to make you pay. And that will be a violation of this free disposal. If you don't have to pay anything to throwing away apples, it's free to throw them away, This is called free disposal. So this technology essentially says that you can throw away freely anything that you don't like. Okay, everyone understands that? So when this happens, this is gonna be called a pure exchange economy. Okay, pure exchange economy. Okay, guys. So now an allocation again is basically this collection of locations of consumption, production plans, and then as you can see, the only requirement is that the consumption vector, right, belongs to the consumption set, and the production plan belongs to the production set. Now, a feasible allocation, we're kind of generalizing some concepts we saw before. We're going to say that a feasible allocation is Pareto optimal if there is no other feasible allocation X prime Y star that Pareto dominates it. That is, there is no other feasible allocation X prime Y prime such that it is better for weakly better for all consumers and then strongly better for one consumer. Okay. The only thing that you can see here is that the Y is not entering directly in the preference part, right? The Y, the only thing that is doing is changing what is feasible and not, right? Because the production plan is gonna make basically the endowments and Y is gonna make determine what is feasible in this economy. Now with this in hand, we're gonna define what is called a private ownership economy, which is a super generalization of the Edgeworth box and the other model of the Robinson Crusoe. Here we're gonna reintroduce these thetas. They're gonna be shares of the claims to property of the profits. So consumer I has initial endowment of omega I and a claim of a share theta ij. So each consumer I has a share or ownership of a firm J. And then essentially you have that the summation over all individuals of the endowment is equal to the total endowment. And then summation over all individuals over the theta ij has to be equal to 1. So the economy is fully owned by the consumers, right? So the firms are fully owned by the consumers. And that's why we call it private ownership. So there is no one else outside the economy that has a stake at a firm, okay? Any question here? So now, given a private ownership economy specified by the triple preferences, production plans, endowments, and the shares of the property structure, an allocation X star, Y star, and a price vector P constitutes a valuation equilibrium if the three things happen. First, production plans are profit maximizing. So essentially this inequality says that the production plan Y star is profit maximizing. So it's the highest profit possible within the feasible allocations given the production plan of each firm J. And then you also have that each allocation of consumption X star is consumer preference maximizing, subject to the endogenous budget. The endogenous budget is essentially given by P times X less than or equal to P times endowment plus the shares of profits that corresponds to you. And then you have a summation here over J because you're getting the profits of all firms J that you own. So some of these theta ij may be a 0, okay? Then 3 markets clear.
Are the YJs going to be negative all the time?
No, YJs, remember
Okay.
that when entries are negative, they are inputs. When entries are positive, they are outputs. When you multiply price times Y, right, this thing is essentially the profit. Profits can be positive and can be negative. Some firms can have losses, right? So you may also absorb the loss. You can also absorb the loss. But in general, right, remember you have some endowments and then essentially you're going to have here a positive income. If you have a negative income, you possibly consume at 0, right? Because you're done. But yeah, that's a possibility. Okay, great.
Where I'm confused is further up because I think we said YJ is in RL minus all the time. If you scroll up just a little, or maybe I missed
sure.
something.
No, this is a definition. So we say an economy is pure exchange. So this is a special case. If the technology, right, is equal to the minus RL. So in that case, this is a free disposal technology that includes 0. So that means that you're going to have essentially 0, or you're going to be throwing away things. So in which
Okay.
case it's negative, okay?
But where we are now isn't necessarily that.
Yeah, so
Got
that's
it.
a full stop. That's why it was another section, right? And now we're at a different section, right? So in
Got
this
it.
section, this is a general case, and then a special case of private ownership is a pure exchange, okay?
Sounds good.
Yeah, 3 means market clearing. So it means that all consumption has to be equal to what? To the total existence of the goods in terms of endowment, plus things that were produced minus things that were consumed. Okay, do you understand? So there are entries in Y when they are negative. You know, they are removing elements in the endowment box, and then they are using them for production means, right? So essentially, Y when negative is going to subtract the feasibility part, right? And when it is producing something, it's going to expand it. Okay. So the role of Y is going to be depending on the sign of the entry of Y. Remember all of these as vectors. So this is index essentially for all L. So this equation is a scalar, right? But you can also write, of course, the vector version, okay? So Y is a vector, and this is written in terms of each good, okay? So now, so this is the private ownership economy, and now we're gonna expand it a bit. So imagine now that I remove private ownership. For instance, I now become a socialist country, right? And now I decide essentially to be able to collect, you know, everything that you have, endowments, through a tax, put it in a big chest, and then be able to essentially give it back at my will. Okay, I'm the central planner, you know, and now I can essentially give you from my royal chest something to you, right? So now this is going to be called price equilibrium with transfers. Okay, so in this economy, what are the primitives? Are going to be preferences, technologies, endowments, and then you have an allocation X star Y star and a price vector P constitute a price equilibrium with transfer if there is an assignment of wealth W with such that essentially the total endowment is going to be equal to the multiplication of prices times the total, sorry. This is a total wealth level. So the notation is now changing. This is the script that LaTeX uses. So this is the W, and this is an omega here on the right-hand side. So the left-hand side is using W. W is the total income I'm giving you. So this is the part that the king gives you to each of you, gives you in form of gold coins. So each W is the gold coin that you receive as a subject of the king, right? And then the right-hand side is the total amount of money that there is in the economy. So it's the total amount that is inside the chest. And this is equal to what? To prices multiplied by the endowment vector, which is without a subscript I, because this is the aggregate endowment, plus the summation of all profits in the economy. So this is a summation over J, because there are capital J firms, and this is just the multiplication of prices times the optimal production plan of each firm J. So what I do in these economies, the king goes, taxes everyone, collects all profits, collects all private endowments, and then makes a big chest where he basically, or she basically puts all this money, right? And this is going to be measured by this price vector. So this is the total amount of gold in the economy. And then it's going to be redistributed to the subjects of the king by means of the vector W, right? And the vector W, which is W1 to W capital I, is the vector of incomes or gold coins given to each subject, right? So W1 is the gold coins that subject one receives. So everyone understands, okay? So now in this economy, this is called a price equilibrium with transfers whenever the following three conditions hold. One, for every J, each firm still profit maximizes. Two, each consumer maximizes their preferences, right? Subject to the following budget. So the budget here is P times Xi, but the income is now given to you by the central planner or the king, which is just equal to Wi. Then three, basically the consumption is feasible. So the summation over xi star is equal to the total endowments plus the total production. So what is new here? WI is given to you by the planner, and the planner has to satisfy the feasibility constraint such that the total coins that he or she redistributes to the subjects has to be equal to whatever this king collected. Okay, this person cannot borrow from other kingdoms. Do you understand? It's a fully, autonomous economy, so no external debt. Do you understand? So whatever you redistribute to your subjects is equal to whatever you collected, okay, from actual production in your economy. You cannot print money, you cannot make funny things, right? It's just what it is, okay? Okay, so what, again, here, one important thing that you have to realize is that, remember that I told you that income was endogenous, right? In the previous economies. Here, income is still endogenous, but in a more subdued way. So remember that we say income is endogenous because it depends on the prices, right? Now, let's look at this equation here. So total income depends on prices, right? So the summation of all incomes of all gold coins is equal, to an equation that depends on prices. So in that sense, the dependence on prices on income is only through the total income, okay? This is in a stark opposition to the private ownership economy where, individual income depends on prices, right? Directly, not through the aggregate income, okay? So these two economies are different, right? Of course, you can reproduce essentially with price equilibrium with transfers any outcome of the private ownership economy, right? That's going to be a little bit the result that we're going to have later. So any questions here about the price equilibrium with transfers? So all of this has been definitions, so we haven't proved anything. So just let's try to understand what they are, right? And now we're going to go to actually doing something with the definitions, okay? So if you have any questions here, is an optimal time. Else I'm going to move on. Okay, no questions? Great. So now we're going to see again the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. So great name, as I told you. We saw it in its baby version. Now we're going to see it in its full glory. So the preference relation, preference sub I, so for individual I, on the consumption set xi is locally non-associated. Again, just to remind you, if for every xi and every epsilon, there is an xi prime such that if there is a ball according to some norm, think of the Euclidean norm, such that x prime is close enough inside this epsilon ball, then it has to be that this x prime is better than xi. So in other words, there is always something close enough inside a ball, in fact, according to certain norm, to any allocation that is strictly better off for this particular individual. So this is locally non-associated, we know this. Now, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics uses this definition. So if preferences are locally associated, and if the triple x star y star p is a price equilibrium with transfers, the definition we just stated moments ago, then the allocation x star y star is Pareto optimal. In particular, any well-rationed equilibrium allocation is Pareto optimal. Any private ownership economy is Pareto optimal. So in other words, we're saying that if you have locally associated preferences, then any price equilibrium with transfers is Pareto optimal. So yet again, I will remind you that Pareto optimal essentially means that you're maximizing the social welfare function. That essentially tells you this principle that you're going to reach an allocation that is not wasteful. So you cannot improve anyone without making someone worse off, right? So this is a non-wasteful allocation, right? It's an efficient allocation. Okay. Now, we're saying now that any price equilibrium with transfers is in fact Pareto optimal. Now, a special case of these economies of price equilibrium with transfers is a well-rationed equilibrium or a private ownership economy, right? So the special case of the price equilibrium with transfers is the well-rationed economy or the free market economy. So it turns out that this private market economy is as well a Pareto optimal allocation. Now, important thing. I told you that the first welfare theorem is the defense of the free market, right? At least that was how our ancestors understood it. It's no longer the case. Here we see an economy where essentially a king came, collected everything that was produced or was owned by the consumers and firms, and then it put it in a big chest, right? And then this king then redistributed at will. And then if the king let the consumers still maximize their preferences and the firms still maximize the profits, and then of course markets clear, then the outcome of that economy was still Pareto optimal. So, so this first order theorem is not really telling you anything about a defense of free market, because this is very far from a free market, right? In fact, everything that existed in the economy was nationalized, right? Was taken away by the king. And then the redistribution was given completely arbitrary way by the king. So this vector of Wi doesn't have any justification to be, right? It's completely arbitrary. However, if we let the consumers maximize their preferences and the consumers maximize their profits and markets clear, the outcome of this economy was still a Pareto optimal, okay? So in other words, there is nothing free about this economy, but what it remains, the decentralization remains. So we are letting individual agents here to do their best, right? They're trying to pursue their own selfish interests, given the structure of ownership that the planifier gave to them, right? So here there is no private ownership anymore, right? But each individual is using their brains, right, to do their best they can. So it's a decentralized solution, okay? So each component of the system is trying to maximize their utility function and their profit function, okay? Do you understand? So the only thing that matters for Pareto optimality is, of course, local association, for sure. But besides that, what it matters is that you are letting individuals do their best. So this is that decentralized solution. So this theorem is essentially telling me you can take any, you can essentially justify decentralized solutions because they are Pareto optimal, okay? So this is really not about free markets in the usual sense, but about the power of decentralization, okay? Any question here? So, okay, so great, we understood the statement. Now let's prove it. For the first time, we're gonna prove it, okay? Until now, we just have discussed this, but we haven't really proved this thing. Now, suppose that X star Y star P is a price equilibrium with transfers, and that the associated well levels are W1 W capital I. Recall that the total amount of income or gold coins here has to be equal to the amount of gold coins inside the chest of the king, right? So we know this. Now, the preference maximization part of the notion of price equilibrium with transfer requires that if there is someone X1 for individual I such that there is an Xi that is strictly better off than the allocation of the star, then due to local non-association, and this is the important part, this is where I use local non-association. It has to be that if there is an allocation Xi that is strictly better than Xi star, remember the Xi star by definition has to be preference maximizing. So if it is preference maximizing and you have a budget, it has to be due to local association that the solution has to be in the budget, right? So it has to be at the frontier. Do you understand? Do you remember this? Okay. So if there is something that is strictly better off, it has to be that it is actually not affordable, right? It's strictly not affordable to you. So this is about revealed preferences, right? So if there is an X star that is strictly preferred to Xi, that is strictly preferred to X star, then P times Xi has to be strictly greater than Wi. So it has to be strictly non-physical. Do you understand? And then Wi by local non-association, Weldr's law has to be exactly equal to P times X star. So under local non-association, we have that essentially this Xi being weakly better than Xi star, then it also has to be weakly non-affordable. We verify this by contradiction. So consider that if you have Xi star weakly better, and we have the contradiction of the previous statement, you have that is strictly affordable, then by local association, there has to be something near the allocation X star that is strictly better off for this Xi, but also affordable, right? Thus making Xi star non-optimal. So this is impossible. Now consider this allocation X, Y, that is Pareto dominant to the X star, Y star in the Pareto sense. And this means that Xi is weakly better than the Xi star for every individual. And then there is one individual for which this Xi is strictly better. That's the definition of Pareto dominance. Now, by the previous arguments, we have essentially that this inequality must hold for all individuals. And then for some individual, this inequality holds strictly positive, strict inequality, sorry, not strictly positive. Hence, if I take the summation of the consumption, right, across all individuals, then I just notice by these inequalities here, right, then this has to be strictly above the total income in the economy. So what these guys are consuming under Xi is more than the gold coins that there are in the economy, okay? So this produces an allocation that is not feasible. So this means that the Xi star that Pareto dominates, the Xi that Pareto dominates Xi star cannot be possibly feasible for consumers. And now I just have to prove by profit maximization, we know that P times Yj has to be greater than or equal to P times Yj. So the star allocation Y is the profit maximizing allocation. This has to be above any other allocation that is inside the production sets. So that means that if I combine everything, that means that the total consumption of these guys has to be above the total existences of goods in the economy, right? And that just follows from the things above, right? So if I combine this inequality with this inequality here, then it means that the original total consumption in monetary terms is above what there is in the economy, as measured in the dollars induced by P. This means that XY is not feasible. There is a contradiction, okay? So thus XY star must be Pareto optimal. So in other words, the proof is not that hard. The only thing that you have to realize is that I'm using a lot local non-association, right? And then the fact that you are local non-association guy, and then you're maximizing your preferences, and this will produce an outcome that is Pareto optimal. So again, this is the formalization of the invisible hand of Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith said, you know, we can achieve something that is socially desirable by means of pursuing individual objectives, right? Selfish objectives. So here, each individual, right, is pursuing their own preference function or profit function, you know, and then given a particular price taking, they are able to coordinate somehow and able to produce an outcome that is Pareto optimal. Now, important thing, when we say Pareto optimal, right? Pareto optimal is a very nice definition that tells me that something is not wasteful. But when we say socially desirable today as a slang, this has way more meaning than Pareto optimal, right? So economists, and I think most people could agree, that you want as a society to achieve a Pareto optimal allocation. But that doesn't mean that all Pareto optimal allocations are socially desirable in the common language, right? So the common language, when you talk with your relatives that are not economists, if you use the word socially desirable, is a very loaded word, right? So it means for a lot of people different things, first of all, but second, you know, it usually means way more than Pareto optimal. So again, if you remove envy from things that are allowable in a discussion, right? Pareto optimality is something that everyone should want, right? If you allow envy, then Pareto optimality is no longer great, right? Because you will like someone to get worse off for you to be happy, right? But usually, you know, these notions are envy-free, right? So we disallow envy. So if we agree that a common, you know, thing that we should agree on is that Pareto optimal is desirable, there is still a lot of allocations that are Pareto optimal. Remember the Edgeworth box? There was this full blue line that essentially were combinations of Pareto allocations. Now, from those, which one do you think is socially desirable? There is no agreed way that economists or social scientists or even thinkers in general have agreed what is the best way. Right now, there is a trend towards equality, and then you have to define equality, and then you have to define the degree of equality that you want, right? So all of that is up for discussion, right? There are other, ideologies that don't want equality at all. They want just to, give more to the more efficient and whatever. All these things are allowed here. So Pareto set does not pin down to a particular allocation that people outside econ will think is socially desirable. So when I say socially desirable, it's only Pareto optimal. So given this very weak notion, right, decentralization works. Now, of course, this works under assumptions, right? The first assumption I'm making is price taking, right? Price taking behavior. As I told you before, right, if firms, for instance, have market power or they can do price discrimination, so price taking fails, and then, decentralized problems are no longer Pareto optimal. Now, another assumption that we're making is that consumers are fully informed. So for instance, consumers have to know all possible prices in the economy and do their best given the best information. If economies are not well informed, so if they fail to pay attention, for instance, to certain prices in the economy, the outcome of the economy may not be Pareto optimal, okay? So there are many reasons and frictions that may actually this first welfare theorem invalid, right? Another reason why this may be invalid, more mechanical, is the lack of local non-association, right? So a classical core exam question is they throw you some weird preferences that are not locally associated, and then they ask you whether the allocation produced by a price equilibrium with transfers without local non-association is Pareto optimal, okay? So the usual instinct of most, because this is a trick question again, is to say, no, it is not Pareto optimal because they are not, they fail local non-association. Of course, this is wrong because local non-association is yet again a sufficient condition. It is not a necessary condition. So there may be economies under which local non-association fails, yet they are Pareto optimal, okay? But because it is not sufficient, so when local association fails, you can also have economies which fail Pareto optimality. So both things are possible. So whenever you see that, that means you have to compute and see it for yourselves. You cannot apply the theorem anymore. Now, if you're lucky, and then if you see in the problem set already preferences that are locally non-associated, and if the rest of the assumptions are there, then you can conclude quickly that this is Pareto optimal. So you know for sure already, and this is the role of the first welfare theorem. Okay, any questions here?
I got a question regarding the equilibrium with transfers that you mentioned that to some extent it is still a decentralized economy because you are letting the individuals to optimize basically. So are there relevant models that do not let the individuals optimize like in this common sense of the word, or?
Well, can you repeat again? So you're saying,
Yeah.
are there any models where?
Yeah, we still let the agents of the economy optimize. So is there, are there models in which, I don't know, some agents are able to do it and some others are not, or something like that?
So you mean a mix of agents where some are maximizers, some are not?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's actually, there are economies like that when you do behavioral econ. So behavioral general equilibrium is something that people are starting exploring. There is very few work on this. So we have one chapter in our notes, which is about, the GAVEX model with sparse max. Originally have a part of that where we study the Edgeworth box with inattentive agents. That's material for provinces, by the way, or exams, right? But in general, right, so if you have inattentive agents, some of them inattentive, then essentially, you no longer have to have Pareto optimality. So the role of inattention, right, is that it may mess up the Pareto optimality of these things. So inattention is another friction, and this actually is another reason why this may fail. So a little bit of question, and I think that's also related to some questions in finance is, imagine you have some noise consumers, right? Or noise traders, or some people call them, right? will this mess up the Pareto optimality? And this is a discussion. So some people have worked out models where these noise traders average out. So the Pareto optimality is not messed up, but it's very hard to define because remember, Pareto optimality requires in their definition that every individual is endowed with preferences, right? Not necessarily fully. So if you look at the definition of Pareto optimality, so in our definition, we're assuming agents are rational, right? But you can modify Pareto optimality to change preferences to be whatever, right? Because the definition of Pareto optimality doesn't require really transitivity or anything like that. We are assuming here, let me be clear, we're assuming the Pareto optimality that everyone is rational, right? For our purposes and historically. But my point is that in order to expand, the notion of Pareto optimality, you have to be very careful when you move outside the world of rationality because there are some caveats there. So people have worked out those, and it is still an open question whether introducing bounded rational agents destroys this. There are examples done in the literature that essentially destroyed the first welfare theorem. So one might conjecture, right, and this is the question, whether introduction of bounded rational agents destroys the benefits of decentralized economies. And just common sense will say that yes, they represent, noise consumers will represent a challenge to decentralized solutions, right? And this is very obvious. So imagine, for instance, that again, you're Uber, and you want to decentralize your problem, right? So you let every taxi driver. So you don't have self-driving yet. So you have real taxi drivers or your Uber drivers. And they use, their apps to decide and their location to decide the best for them. So they're maximizing profits. So imagine some of them, they are just trolls. So they want to randomly drive around, You can easily imagine that if the number of, troll drivers starts growing, then the whole model by Uber will be, take it to oblivion, right? Another reason, is also that, and this is actually from real life, is that price taking. So Uber works under the assumption that taxi drivers cannot have market power, right? So they are so small that they are going to see the price surge and, just behave accordingly. So maximize the profits, of course. But, there has been cases where a lot of Uber drivers coordinate because they have means of communication, right? Social media. And then essentially they get together and they try to move outside certain areas to increase the price, and then they move. So for instance, the typical place where they coordinate is airports. So that in airports, if there are no taxi drivers, then price surge is gonna kick up, right, quickly. So a lot of the taxi drivers write to each other and say, let's move for half an hour outside the perimeter of Person International, right? And then they're waiting there until they see the price surge to whatever level they think is not that suspicious, and then they start driving inside. You see? So of course, this is the challenges to decentralization. You see? So first is people are too stupid, and the second challenge is people are too smart. So it's kind of a middle point, right? So you don't coordinate, are not these guys that somehow figure out the algorithm of Uber and hack it, right? You're not too smart, and you're not too stupid, right? You're not randomly driving in the wrong direction, right? Then Uber is screwed, right? So you need some middle level, right? So what we have learned now this is the nice thing about math, right? We see barebone the benefits of decentralization, and this was a little bit like dogma before. You say, look, this is why the US beat the USSR, right? They are not great. We are, that's the US thing, with the free markets. But now we see, look, maybe we have a really good computer. Maybe it's better than a lot of taxi drivers, right? And maybe we have self-driving cars. Maybe they do better, right? Who knows, right? And this is something that arises now because centralized systems are getting better, right? And actually, we're learning more about free markets and decentralized systems since they got so popular. So we got many of them, and now we start seeing their flaws, right? So clearly now we see the issues with these kind of systems. So we're a little bit more aware about the issues of centralized systems. So summary, this is not a religion class. So we know everything is bad. So we start from that benchmark. we just see that there are certain benefits, right? And essentially this theorem is telling me you can decentralize things, right? And Uber has done it, many other people have done it. Same thing with Airbnb. A lot of platforms in the internet are based on this idea, right? This is a really cool idea, decentralizing your problems. And now, we're saying essentially, one thing that we actually learn also from this math is that you don't need private ownership. So this is a big, important thing you have to realize. Private ownership is not a part of the social desirability of invisible hand, right? So this is a little bit where Smith is separated from Locke, right? So Locke wanted private ownership, right? This is the historical liberalism, and this is where you get mixed with politics. This math tells you, look, private ownership doesn't matter, I can essentially remove all the money from the economy and then give you as I wish. Still, things should be nice, you see? Now, where things get bad, and this is something, a good lesson if you ever become, the Minister of Finance of some country, right? Where you start advising on a high level, that it can happen, of course. A lot of people from Western are now, in high positions. So remember to not mess up. If you do decentralized solutions, don't mess up with the price. Right? So it doesn't matter if you do redistribution. This theorem is telling you redistribution is okay. Even extreme redistribution is completely fine. What is
doing the
bad,
transfers without affecting the prices.
Yeah, the prices is the issue, right? So if you are Maduro or Chavez, from Venezuela, this is a tragic story.
Cristina.
Martin, he knows. So that's why Latin Americans become macroeconomists out of spite, highly motivated. But a lot of macroeconomists are Latinos, right? They have experienced inflation firsthand. But essentially, if you mess up with prices, things get terrible. Because remember, the decentralized system, how people communicate, right? So remember these systems, they are from the time of Adam Smith. There was no WhatsApp, there was nothing. There was not Reddit, Wall Street bets, nothing, right? There was no way to coordinate. So what is the way people coordinate here magically? Well, the magic is the price. The price is a number, right, at which people produce and people consume. You go to a market, say, how much is the bread? Okay, $1. Okay, I like it. I'm gonna buy it, right? $1. Can I produce bread? For sure. You see, this number makes people do things, right? There is a signal in the market. It's a piece of information, very simple one. It's a number that allows people to do things, okay? Now imagine you are the president of Venezuela, right? And you say, now, I wake up with the idea that I'm gonna create the sovereign bread, which is essentially the same bread as before, but it's gonna cost half as much. So I changed the number to half the price. So it was not $1, it's 50 cents. And now people are a little bit confused, right? Consumers want more of it because, it's half the price for sure. But what about producers, right? So they say, why is now 50? Maybe some of them can produce, others cannot, right? And then, of course, bread starts disappearing, right? So the issue is that price arises from these very complex interactions, right? And it's a point at which people are able to do collective action. Now, if you have a random guy comes and erases the price and puts another price at random, then of course you're gonna destroy things. Of course, we're assuming the planifier in this example is stupid, like Maduro, right? Stupid guy. Now, imagine that you're Uber, you're smart, you have a big computer, you hire guys from Berkeley, you have the data scientists from Chicago, from everywhere in the world, best mathematicians. Now, can you change prices in a way that actually helps the economy? Yes, you can, right? That's the idea of the source price, right? You can change it in a smart way to be able to make it closer to the ideal market clearing price. So you remember that the market clearing price is an ideal, right? Most real marketplaces don't achieve it, right? So a lot of sellers are selling for too high, right? This happens a lot, for instance, in these very, market places like Etsy. Have you used Etsy, right? There is a lot of people, doing crafts and so on and selling them. So a lot of them say, look, I did this collar, it's gonna cost $1 million, right? Now I'm exaggerating, but it's gonna be super expensive because I spent a lot of time, and it's super nice. Yeah, someone's gonna buy it, not really, right? So then they have to adjust it, right? And then at some point, someone's gonna buy it. So this process is very hard. But at some point, because Etsy has been around for a long time, then people start copying prices, right? And essentially somehow they coordinate, and now they know this particular type of crabs goes for $2, right? So this is how price, this is not a theory of price formation. We assume the magic has happened and the prices came to us, right? So this is not about price formation. Prices are there. But if such price arises, then things magically happen. So remember that here in this thing, there is a missing piece, which is the actual price formation, right? Price formation is not explained here, right? But once you have a price, then people can coordinate, right? Now in real life, of course, in real marketplaces, people are moving around prices until supply meets demand. So it's kind of a search algorithm, as I mentioned, right? So this system is trying to optimize. So this is what happens. And of course, a smart central planner can help the decentralized people to fix the price, okay? To try to get a price that's closer to the thing that is gonna be the market clearing. And that's what Uber does. So real life systems that are gonna work well are gonna be a mix, right? But now we just study, that you can decentralize Pareto optimality, okay? Great. So we studied the first welfare theorem. And now, we are just gonna state some definitions, and we're gonna state the second welfare theorem. The second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, the proof is super long. In fact, I think is the most challenging proof together with the existence of general equilibrium. So these are the ones where you actually have to pay a lot of attention. I remember studying them for full 2 days, until getting them completely, so it's a hard proof. So we're gonna start easy and we're gonna prove it next class. So right now we're just gonna establish the foundations, right? The second welfare theorem essentially says that I can take some point in the Pareto set and I can support it as a price equilibrium with transfers, okay? That's what I'm gonna do. Now, it's not gonna be any kind of equilibrium with transfers. It's gonna be one where preferences are convex. So utility functions are quasi-concave. That's the mirror image of preference being convex. And when you have a strong monotonicity, so you are gonna have this under additional assumptions. So first welfare theorem only works with local association. Super minimalistic, nice. Second welfare theorem needs more. Remember always this, there is an asymmetry. Second welfare theorem needs a strong monotonicity, and in fact, it's gonna need convexity, okay? Remember this. Now, the first thing we're gonna need is a thing that I always hated, but it always appears in the core exams. So it's a very mathematical thing that its sole purpose is that it is gonna be used in the proof of the second welfare theorem. However, it has the habit of appearing in core exams, okay? So you know it, you have been warned. Again, it's not my choice. It's an equilibrium choice of the historical, question in general equilibrium. It's part of the rite of passage. But remember, its real purpose is a piece of the proof of the second welfare theorem. Okay, so it has a good honorable reason of being, right? At least it's not useless, right? This is the objective of this. So the price quasi equilibrium with transfer, which is a very nice name, is the following: is an economy with preferences, production sets, an allocation vector x star y star and a price p constitutes a price quasi equilibrium with transfers if there is an assignment of wealth levels. So this vector of coins, gold coins, W1 to ... W capital I, such that, of course, the feasibility constraint holds, so there is no foreign debt, external debt. So summation of Wi is equal to P times omega plus summation of P times Yj over all firms. And three things happen. And these three things are suspiciously close to the equilibrium with transfers, but only condition 2 is going to change. And that's the only difference. Condition 1 is exactly the same as before. So all firms profit maximize. Condition 2 is where the magic happens. So every individual I is such that if there is an alternative xi that is strictly better to xi star, the allocation of interest, then this allocation x is going to be strictly non-affordable, okay? So the key thing here is that the new condition 2 does not imply preference maximization, okay? Does not imply preference maximization, okay? So this condition only tells you whatever you're consuming, it has to be expenditure minimizing, right? That's the only thing it has to be, okay? Expenditure minimizing, because if there is anything else that is strictly preferred, it has to be more expensive. Do you understand? But it doesn't mean. Yep.
Is it the inequality is strict inequality or just inequality there in number 2?
No, in this particular case, that's the difference exactly. So if you have local association and you have utility maximization, then this would be a strict inequality as we use in the proof of the first welfare theorem. So that's a good observation, Martin. This second assumption is weaker than utility maximization. So essentially, it's not assuming at this stage local association. We're gonna later on assume more, but at this stage, the definition is weaker than what you said, okay? So for that same reason, xi star is strictly better off means that you're weakly affordable, more not affordable, right? It can be equal, in fact, in this particular case, okay? And then the third one is market clearing. So from the 3 things, only the second has changed. Now, I'm gonna just read the second welfare theorem, and then I'm gonna make just a comment. So note that price equilibrium differs from quasi-equilibrium, differs from price equilibrium only in the part 2. Preference maximization implies 2, but 2 does not imply preference maximization. Hence, any price equilibrium with transfers is a price quasi-equilibrium with transfers, but the converse is not true. Under local association, we can write the following as follows, right? So essentially, for every I, if you have this better than that, you have that this is above, right? So this should be the strict definition, of course, as Martin mentioned. Else will be exactly the same, okay? So that's the typo. Now, second welfare theorem, and this is the only thing I'm gonna do right now, then I'm gonna stop the class. Consider an economy specified by X consumption spaces, preferences, production plans, and suppose that every production plan is convex, so so returns are non-increasing, and every preference relation is convex, so utilities are quasi-concave and locally non-shaded. Then for every Pareto optimal allocation X star Y star, there is a price vector P different from 0. Notice we are not requiring at this stage prices are positive. This P vector is just different from 0. And this notation means that not all entries are 0. So there is at least one entry that is not 0, such that X star, Y star, P is a price quasi-equilibrium with transfers. So all of this is to say that I can take any allocation, right, that is Pareto optimal, and then I can create a vector of prices, possibly negative, some of them, but some of them not 0, such that there is an allocation X star, Y star, and P that is a price quasi-equilibrium transfer. So essentially, this central planner can tax everything in the economy, redistribute it in gold coins or Bitcoins, and then essentially let people do their thing. I'm replacing preference maximization, but this weaker thing of cost minimization, right? The condition 2 in quasi-equilibrium with transfers. That's the only difference. And then essentially I'm able to obtain the same Pareto allocation I wanted, okay? And then, I'm gonna prove this as you can see, it's a very long proof. I'm gonna do it in the next class. So this is gonna use the separating hyperplane theorem. To study the math regarding this proof, you can go to the appendix in Mas-Colel and study the separating hyperplane theorem, please. And then essentially we're gonna prove the refinement of these results to essentially be able to make it an equilibrium with transfers. So we're gonna get there. I'm gonna do a next class. At this stage is useless, so I'm gonna stop the recording.